And so just a quick recap. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Noah trusted in God when everyone else says he was wrong. Last week, Abraham trusted that God would still be faithful even in his testing. And that testing leads to trusting. Now, our three main things that we've been having as the backdrop of all of this is the first part of Hebrews 11. Faith is hoping, faith is believing, and that faith is trusting. So if you have your Bibles this morning, if you would turn to Hebrews chapter 11 as we continue our series over Hebrews 11. We're going to pick up starting in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated for the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater than wealth and the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. And so in this, we see a short synopsis of everything that happens in Moses' story, but it's so much greater than that. So, if you would, please turn back to Exodus chapter 1. If you had the blue Bible in the pew, it is page 27. Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and as slaves, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And so we think, well, that's pretty brutal. How did they get there? So if we go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the sons of Jacob, there was a famine in the land. And if you remember the story of Joseph and his, we now think of it as his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Thank you, Broadway. That he got sold into slavery. He ended up in Egypt. He becomes the ruler of Egypt. And so the rest of his family all moves to Egypt. And then what happens? A new Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph. So Joseph went from being second in charge to his family probably being highly regarded by the Egyptians to now they're slaves. Now, is this all in God's planning? Yep. We talked about it last week. Last week in God's covenant to Abraham in Genesis 15, God told Abraham that for 400 years your people will be enslaved, but they will come out better than before. And so that's the stage that we're in now. But with that, God promised deliverance would come. So, Moses, as we know, the little basket, we grew up in Sunday school. How many of you remember the felt boards that your teachers used to put little things on? I like the felt boards. I wish we still had the felt boards. Those were just fun. But we see the little basket, they put the baby on top of the basket. But that same Pharaoh decided that it was enough of the Hebrews that he didn't want them to populate anymore. And if you get rid of the boys, and you get rid of half the equation for what takes for more people to happen, then he thought he'd be good. But we see even in Exodus that Moses' mother trusted God, and she put him in a basket and she sent him down the river. And you have to wonder, as a mother, what you would think, not just trusting God enough just to do that, but when you find out he was found by a princess of Egypt, that she was then called to come help raise the child, that then her son would become a prince of Egypt. It's kind of crazy to think how God works sometimes. That all along the way, when we don't see how things are going to work out, God is underpinning every little thing that's going on. And so as Moses is going on, he's growing up as a prince of Egypt. What happens? He sees a Hebrew being abused one day, and he says, I'm going to stop this. And he kills him. And in his nervousness, he runs away to a land called Midian. He meets Jethro, who would soon become his father-in-law. He helps save his 3 daughters at the well. And so Moses decides to change his life and goes from a prince of Egypt to somebody who herds sheep. A little bit of a difference. Getting everything that you want at the snap of your finger to, I'm going to go sit outside where it's blazing hot and watch sheep all day. How many of you would they make that trade? How many would you give up mani-pedis every day to go sit outside and sweat? Not even by a pool with a little drink in your hand with a little umbrella. But Moses gave that up. But God wasn't done with Moses. Let's go to Exodus 2:23-25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and I like this last part, and God knew. Our first fill in the blank of the day was also in last week's, but that God is always faithful to his promises. That a covenant that was made over 400 years ago, that God could have just said, I don't care. But if remember that covenant was made in that suzerain treaty to where we said, that God had them split the calf, walk through it, and what was the sign of the thing? That if either side broke it, may the same be done to me. But God kept his promise. So let's go to Exodus chapter 3, the infamous burning bush. Now, I told everybody last week there'd be a prop this week. And so I grabbed one of the fake trees out of the hallway. And one of the youth boys asked me, so are you going to set that thing on fire? Thought about it, not a good idea. So this will be our burning bush this week that's not on fire because, I didn't feel like calling the fire department this morning. So Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of fire of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take off your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Let's pause right there for a second. This is the first time in biblical history that God has specifically given his name to someone. Every other account of a name that we see in the Bible, it is man giving a name to God. The name that we have here, as we say it now, is Yahweh. It's translated as I am. Now there's many names for God that are seen in the Old Testament. Here's just a couple of them. Elyon, which translates the Lord Most High. El Roi, the God who sees. El Shaddai, the God who is sufficient for the needs of his people. Jehovah Nissi, the Lord our banner. Jehovah Raphi, the Lord our shepherd. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord our healer. Jehovah Shalom, the Lord our peace. But it's at this point to where God gives his name to the people. He says, This is what you shall call me. And in the difference in our English translations of the Bible, when the name Yahweh is used, it's capital O, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The preacher that I grew up under, he made sure that he said that every single time that he preached. He wouldn't say Lord, he'd go, and then capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Because in the Hebrew, the little Lord that we use, big case L, O-R-D, is the word El. And so El means God, and then normally we see something with it. If we see just Elohim, it is God in the plural, which is showing the importance of that God. Because when we see God used for all the gods of all the different nations around Israel, the Hittites, the Midianites, it's just El. Which, I'm a nerd, so I like this stuff. But when you look at it, it shows the importance, and even more so, the attention to detail that people put when they were writing this. For as tradition, when a priest came to copy the name Yahweh, when they got to that point, they had to stop, they had to go bathe, they would come back, they would write Yahweh, they would then leave, they would go wash again and come back. That is how holy from this point that the people of Israel treated the name of God. How often do we do that? How often do we pay importance to God that in all his majesty, before the foundation of the earth, he says he chose each and every single one of you? That after Adam sinned, God could have said, we can start this whole thing over and just light the world on fire and start over. But he didn't. Because God, in his knowing, in his all-knowing, but yet in his richness and his mercy, still created man. Man sinned, but God still made a way for redemption. That's why I am is important. That is why God being faithful to his promises is important. Because we talked about the Abrahamic covenant last week, but even before that, there's the covenant that God made to Adam that a Savior would one day come. And so we see this underpinning, and that's why every time when we talk about salvation, about redemption, it has to start at the garden, because the garden's where everything fell apart. But the garden had to happen before the garden with the empty tomb could happen. So let's pick back up in chapter 3. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord of the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you in what has been done to you in Egypt. And if I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Pezerites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Pause. You have to know that after being in Egypt under the oppression, and even if you look at a picture of Egypt today, does that look really pleasant? How good does a land flowing with milk and honey sound? That's why they called it the Promised Land. Not just because God had promised it, but because it sounded good. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go to 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold and jewelry, for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So shall you plunder the Egyptians. Once again, going back to the Abrahamic covenant, God said after what? After 400 years, you're going to come out better than when you went in. Now let's go over to continue in chapter 4. Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. That has to be a little bit scary. How many of you really want to grab a snake? So he put out his hand and he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And when he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water of the Nile and pour it on dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So after all that, here comes Moses. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. But the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you and to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff, which you shall do the signs. Every time I think about this, I think about the movie Prince of Egypt, which came out probably early 2000s. And every time I hear Moses or read it, Moses talking to God, I think back to that cartoon movie and how angry the voice of God sounded at Moses. But it wasn't just anger, you could hear the love in it. Because what does God say in just saying, I'm done with you? Was it not I, God, who had fulfilled all these promises to your ancestors? If I did that for them, do you not think that I can make you be able to talk right? Think about that. That when everything else that God had just done, he's standing by a bush that's on fire but not burning, and he's saying, God, are you sure you can do that? Are you sure that I can do that? Here's our next point. If God calls you to something, he will equip you to do it, or he will send someone else with you. God will never call you to something without equipping you to do it. You might not know what that's going. You see, now as we read this, we see the end of the story before we necessarily see the beginning. We know the story, most of us. But at the same time, you have to wonder in that moment, if God was verbally speaking to me, one, I'd be scared out of my mind. Two, I'd be like, there's a burning bush and it's not on fire. And I'm not sure I could even say anything at all, let alone make excuses in the presence of God Almighty. But later on, we see that Moses learns his lesson when he sees God again on the mountain after the Exodus. And he doesn't make excuses that time. For me, never in my life would I thought that I'd be the interim pastor of a church. I'm a musician by trade. I'm a musician by degrees. But God had other plans in store when we came to Canadian. I left the church we were at because I wanted to get out of youth ministry, and I get here, and 2 months later, Austin leaves, and I'm taking over youth too. It's like, thanks, God. Because we came out here thinking I was just going to do music and administration because I was told we need a new music person, we need somebody to help organize the church and do all the fancy paperwork. And now there's binders of procedures and stuff that nobody ever wants to read. But God has a way of equipping us along the way. Even for me, as I think back, that when I worked at the place that I call Chuck E. Cheese on steroids, that God was preparing me to run a church financially. That along the way, that in that dealing with difficult people, not that people in church are ever difficult, but God taught me how to deal with people in the right way. That teaching college students at different points while I was in my undergraduate and my graduate degrees got me ready to be able to do this. I am not a preacher, I am a teacher, and I will happily say so. But God has a way of preparing us all along the way. But here's the fun part. The majority of the time, God does not call those who are perfect. He called those who are broken so that he can make them whole again in his image. When I think about that, I think about the armed forces. What's the first thing that they do when you get to boot camp? Do you know? They break you down. Everything that you thought you knew, when you get in front of that drill sergeant, you know nothing. My best friend went into the Marines right after high school, and when I finally got to talk to him, he said, I thought I knew it all going in. He said, I learned I knew nothing compared to my drill sergeant. But when they come out, they're ready for what they're to do. And sometimes God has to break us before he can build us back up too. If God can take an adulterer in Abraham to become the father of the nation that would be his own that he chose, that if God can take a murderer like Moses to bring the people of Israel out of bondage, God can take any of us and use us. That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of the gospel. That some of the people who I know that are most on fire for Jesus Christ is because they have been the most broken in their past, but they're the most vocal about telling people what Jesus can do. That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of God, what God can do. God can make the broken things beautiful. God can equip you and I to do whatever He has called us to do, regardless of past, regardless of what you think the future is. If you ask most pastors around the country if they ever thought they'd be a pastor, most of them would say no. More and more pastors nowadays that are going into seminary are going in later in life as a second career because that's when God's calling them. But they bring with them a whole plethora of experiences. You know, one of the things they teach you in seminary is they say, never tell a good story about yourself, always tell a bad story so people can be like, hey, we can relate. But God wants to make broken things beautiful. One thing that's interesting, second prop of the week, is that as I was looking at Google and in my Bible software, and I was thinking about Moses as a shepherd, I was thinking a shepherd's hook. Because that's what we see most of the time. That's what we see pictured with David. But when you actually do a search on Moses, they show a straight shaft. That this stick would have been his best friend, because if you actually look at where Moses would have been living in Midian, it was rocky terrain, to where it would have been really easy to stumble, really would have been easy to fall and eat it. But he also would have used the staff to fend off wolves, to fend off beasts. And you have to wonder what he thought when God said, pick up that stick and drop it and watch what it will do. The stick that after Moses questioned God, as we'll see in a minute, by faith he held it out and the Red Sea split. That because of what God can do to a piece of wood, imagine what he can do for us. And in my life and in your life. But this stick wouldn't just be something that would go away from Moses, that stick would be something that would inspire the people of Israel. It'd be one of the items that would go in the Ark of the Covenant after it was built, after Moses died. That Moses' staff would become a sign of hope to the people of Israel. From a shepherd to a leader. You have to wonder, as we see all these different biblical accounts, what these people were thinking. Because we see things from third person, but you have to wonder, if only we do. And I know some of you, like me, have a list of things you want to ask God when you get to heaven. But if God can use a stick. But as Moses went back with Aaron, as they stood before Pharaoh and said, let my people go, he would have had this stick. For every plague that came through, whether it be locust, the plague of darkness, the famine, the whole Nile turning to blood, you have to wonder. When God said, kill perfect lambs and put the blood around the doorpost, for the Spirit would come to slaughter all firstborn who didn't have it. Take some faith to think that God's telling you to put blood around a doorpost. But they did. And as they left Egypt, they took all the riches of Egypt they could take. Because why? God was faithful to his promises. For the covenant that God made with Abraham continued all the way through to as they came out, and Pharaoh said, let them go, that he was done. He's like, I don't want these people around anymore. It's better just to let them go. But then as they were going, Pharaoh changed his mind and he set his chariots, his armies. At that point, Egypt would have been the mightiest war power in the world. But God knew what he was doing. And as the people of Israel were backed up to the Red Sea, probably scared for their lives, God told Moses what to do, and Moses stepped out by faith and did it. And the Red Sea parted. And what happened? They went through, and then the chariots of Pharaoh decided to follow them. They were swept away. That all along the way, that God had a plan if the people of Israel would only trust Him. And when God has a plan to fulfill His plan, the Lord will fight for you. Because the battle all along is the Lord's. This battle against good and evil that wages today. We might lose certain battles, but we know the end of the story. That even when we don't see what God is doing or how God is working, the battle is the Lord's and not ours.